Okay, shall we make a start? So this microphone doesn't do anything to amplify my voice. Can people at the back hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. For those of you who are new to the group, the structure of the group is presentation, break, and then either a continuation of the presentation or questions. Today I'm delighted to welcome Elliot in a role of presenter. So some of you who've been coming to the group for a while will know Elliot. He is one of our self-proclaimed nerd consultants and one of our anime amigos. And I'm hoping you're aware at Axia we truly value people's interests. We don't just play lip service, and we don't call them repetitive and all the other horrible terms that are in the diagnostic categories. So this is going to be a really interesting presentation in the light of attacks on autistic people that have been coming left, right and centre. But in Elliot's inimitable style, he's going to deliver it in a way that there will be some laughs and you will feel safe, I hope. We will make sure you feel safe, okay? In terms of ground rules, there are very few ground rules here. This group of people know the importance of confidentiality. I don't expect you to go away and talk about anybody that's at this group. You know how important confidentiality is. We also need to respect our differences. So if people need to get up, move around, that's fine, whatever you need to do. If you need to concentrate by doing something else, like Calvin, I hope you don't mind me pointing out, for Calvin to concentrate, it's much easier if he's also playing on his Switch at the same time. We know how easy that is to get things misinterpreted, where you're going, why don't you put that down so you can concentrate?
Nearly being the third boss.
Right, okay. So...
well done, Calvin.
We will have a break and there will be refreshments. There may be time for questions. Elliot's going to be in control of that. Okay, so as they say, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Elliot.
Wow, this is very weird being at the front here. Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? Good. Glad to hear. We always like things being good here. And welcome to my presentation on war on vaccines, the MMR Scare and the Modern Anti-Vax Movement. First of all, I will have to apologize. This is going to be a bit of a long one, so there may not be time for questions at the end, and there may not be that many questions. And if we do, it won't be that many. So if you have any questions for me, do not be afraid to come to me during a break or afterwards. I'll stay for as long as needed. And second of all, I'll be the first to admit this is going to be a bit of a fast-paced one, and I may talk kind of quickly. So I do apologize if you do struggle keeping up. I will try and do it to the best of my ability. So I want to start off by, sorry, is it turned off? Yeah, it is, sorry. There we go. I want to start by citing my key sources because I will be frank, I did steal a lot from these, including pictures from them. So I want to just get out of the way so I'm not accused of plagiarism. First of all, Vaccines and Autism, a measured response by H. Bomber Guide. This is the video that got me interested in this to begin with. Really funny, really insightful, very well researched. Recommend it a lot. The second one is Brian Deer's 2004 documentary on End of Wakefield. This is the documentary called MMR, What They Didn't Tell You. It is, hello. This is basically a documentary that happens during the time of the MMR Scare. And I also recommend, well, I actually have here, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, also by Brian Deer. I was not able to use this much in research, unfortunately, but I enjoyed what was read of it, so if you would like to borrow a copy, I have mine right here. And so let's get straight into it, starting with an introduction to me. Hi. So, oh, by the way, I'd like to note that isn't beer, by the way. That's my very own patented stupid juice. So my name is Elliot Chapman. I am a nerd consultant and an amigo here at Axia. So yes, I'm very much out of my comfort zone. My interests include anime, gaming of all types, board games, video games, card games, what have you. I am an absolute music fanatic, metal especially, I am an addict to. I'm a fan of everything sci-fi and fantasy, mostly sci-fi and fantasy books. And I'm also the lifelong winner of the worst joke told in the most inappropriate moments. I'm quite proud of that one. So I want to start off by asking you all a question. It's a very simple question. You don't have to say it out loud, but I am expecting you all to get it right, all the pressure. Do vaccines cause autism? I'll give you a couple seconds to think that. I noticed some of you coming up with the answer. You are correct. The correct answer is, of course, no! Vaccines are an important part of life. They are not only something that is required for us to live a fulfilling life, but just so that we can live. They prevent very preventable diseases, and it is incredibly important we take them, especially at younger ages. And while there are many side effects that could come from vaccines, some quite mild, some possibly severe if you have an allergic reaction to some of the chemicals, autism is not one of those side effects. The only way for you to become autistic is for a man and a woman to have a lovely time behind the McDonald's bins. And yeah, it's the correct reaction to that. And 9 months later, someone pops out, possibly autistic. The only way to become autistic is to be born with it, essentially. That's pretty common knowledge at this point. And yet, for some reason, there are plenty of people out there who still believe that there is a link, that there is something and some external force that is creating autism, mostly due to the fact that autism really you really see signs of autism as your brain develops rather than straight away. With vaccines being one of the main things that people blame for this. I will apologize as well. I may stumble on words quite often. Obviously, a big reason for that is, of course, the MMR scare. And really, surprisingly, this is still kind of a recent event. It's not even 30 years old. Some of you were probably growing up during this time period. Some of you were adults. I would even imagine some of you were parents during this time period. Actually, a quick story. When I told my mum, who's here today actually, I mentioned that, and when I told her I was doing this, she actually brought up a memory, because I was born in '97. The MMR scare started the year afterwards. So when I was meant to get the MMR vaccine, she actually brought up a memory of her calling up the doctors to make sure it was okay for me to have the vaccine. And well, good I had it, because here I am today, 28 years old and autistic. You chose wrong, mother. And so, seeing as I am viewing this as a bit of a history lesson, I want to go through the class objectives. Isn't that nice? It's just like being back at school, isn't it? Even comes with its own angry teacher. So here's what we're going to be looking at today. Who and what started the MMR scare, how it began, basically what happened during it, and what made it become such a big deal. I also want to talk about how it was debunked, because obviously we now know it's all a bunch of nonsense. A lot of people obviously now know that it was all fake, so how was it done? Why did people become anti-vax? A lot of this is going to be speculatory, just by my own views on human behavior and from what I've heard from secondhand knowledge. And finally, how it has affected modern day. How modern day has obviously, just been affected by it. What's changed, what hasn't, all that stuff. But before we get into any of that, I want to start off by telling you all a story, because for a couple of reasons. First of all, I will be the first to acknowledge this is going to be a bit of a depressing talk. I know at PDSGs we have had people talk about kind of depressing topics, but they have always been with the means of making you more aware of stuff and making you better knowledgeable about autism and the benefits you could get from it. No, this is just mostly going to be depressing. So I want to start off with something a bit lighter and a bit more fun, just to get us started off. And the second reason I want to tell you this is because in my opinion, a lot of the events in this story are quite similar to what happened during the MMR scare. Some of you may think I'm talking nonsense, and that might be true, but I personally think there is some connection there. And I'd like to know as well, everything I'm about to tell you 100% happened. It's one of my favorite stories in history. So let me tell you about the story of I Libertine. So the year is 1956, and we are following this man here, Gene Shepherd, a late-night radio show host. And Gene Shepherd has a lot of opinions on the society at the times and a lot of issues with society that he brings to his radio show often. And the subject for tonight is people's obsessions with lists. Now, obviously, we see lists all the time nowadays, mostly list articles. BuzzFeed got their stuff from somewhere. It's a good way to inform people and get them more, and essentially to get recommendations and whatnot. However, back then, the obsession with lists were more rampant to the point where if your product or any form of media was not on a particular list, in the eyes of the public, it didn't exist, which of course led to the general public only really consuming things that were on lists, and some people even just lying about it to stay current with the times. This especially got to Shepard's ire when he went into a bookstore asking for a transcript for a radio serial he really liked, only to be told that this radio serial must not exist because it's not on any of the lists. So he brought his issues to the radio show, and that night he and his audience hatched a plan. It's quite a simple plan, but it was very effective in showing the invalidity of lists. And the plan was simple. The next day, he and his audience will go out to random bookstores all across the country and ask for a copy of I Libertine by author Frederick Ewing, a pretentious-sounding book by a pretentious-sounding author that didn't exist. Neither of these existed. They came up with an entire backstory for Frederick Ewing, how he worked for the BBC for a time, how the book was essentially a 18th century erotica based in London, and how it was the first book in a planned trilogy. So the next day, they all went out and chaos ensued. That first day alone, one bookstore in particular got 27 requests for the book in that single day. There were people who got library cards, just opened files on Frederick Ewing, and there were even some people who probably went away that day the next day anyway, but who asked for requests in places like Paris and Rome. And eventually, the general public learned about this, and which of course meant that people started talking. And there are a number of funny stories. I'm going to tell you the main three the only three I could find, really, because they are really funny. There was one of a listener, who went into a bookstore, went to the front counter, and did the usual, asking for a copy of I Libertine by Frederick Ewing. And the man behind the counter said, "Ewing, it's about time the public discovered him." And he started going on about how he was such a big fan of Ewing, how he would be following for years, and essentially long before people were aware of I Libertine. Essentially the equivalent of two people talking about the Lord of the Rings film trilogy and how Peter Jackson was such an amazing director, and someone essentially going, "I was a fan of Peter Jackson before Lord of the Rings." That kind of person. There was another woman who went to a bridge club and casually mentioned that she had been reading I Libertine, and then 3 separate women at the group started discussing the book. And that's not the best part. The best part is not only had all 3 of them read it, they had all finished it, and 2 of them didn't like it. There was even one listener who handed in a 9-page term paper to his university about Frederick Ewing. And he included his time working at the BBC, footnotes and references, and you know what? He got a B+. The lecturer said superb research. And then also newspapers started talking about it, and not just in the sense that people of what you would expect, some saying, "Where is this book that everyone's talking about? Why can we not find a copy?" They were writing as if they had read the book. It's shown up on multiple lists, including bestsellers. There were people who had reviewed the book. There was even one journalist who wrote an article about how he had just had lunch with Frederick Ewing and his wife Marjorie on their way to Africa. I'm not making this up. So what happened? One journalist saw everything, thought this is a bit suspect, went out, did the research, discovered Gene's plan. He went up to him and he came clean instantly, and the public were exposed for the liars they were. It's a funny story. I really enjoy it. So now let's actually get into the main topic, why we're here. I want to start off by introducing this man. Please save your booze until the end. I present to you Andrew Jeremy Wakefield. Born on the 3rd of September 1996 to Bridget and Graham Wakefield. He was the second of 5 children, and it felt almost prophetic that he would become a doctor himself, because both his parents were doctors, his grandfather was a doctor, and so was his great-grandfather. Therefore, it only felt appropriate that he would become one down the line. So he graduated from St. Mary's Medical School in 1981, joined the Royal College of Doctors in 1985, and even did a further 2 years in Toronto, Canada in 1987, before eventually becoming a gastroenterologist at the Royal Free Hospital at some point in the 90s. I couldn't find an exact date. He is also the father of the MMR Scare. This is a man who started it all, the one who begun the whole thing. And This is essentially how it began, for his own words. So, some point in 1993, he got a phone call from a woman talking about how her son had been having behavioral issues. It changed overnight, and it seemed to happen not long after he had his MMR vaccine. Now, did Wakefield work with vaccines? No. He's a gastroenterologist, essentially meaning he does gastrointestinal diseases, mostly focused around things like the abdomen, the intestines, what have you. Does he work with autistic children? Not really. He doesn't really have much knowledge on autism. Did that stop him? Absolutely not. He went out, he did the research, and eventually in 1993, he also began a study linking MMR and autism with doing an experiment on 12 children. And eventually in 1998, he published these findings to the Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical magazines in the world. And let's say we have a look at them right here. No, don't you hate when people write on documents? Yeah, in case it wasn't obvious, this paper is no longer really valid, as it was in fact retracted from the Lancet in 2010. But I'm still going to talk about it. So Wakefield's hypothesis was essentially that the MMR vaccine would cause a bowel disease that would then make the child autistic. This is a disease that he called autistic enterocolitis. And what say we talk about how exactly that works? What does autistic enterocolitis entail? Well, first of all, child gets the MMR vaccine, pretty standard. The live measles virus within the MMR vaccine remains in the child's intestines, which was essentially, because MMR is one of those vaccines that does have a bit of the disease within it, not quite dead, but close enough to essentially help with immunity. This then causes the enterocolitis, or inflammation within the intestines, which causes milk and wheat to get trapped and therefore not fully digested. The trapped food then emits a chemical that leaks into the brain, or as Wakefield calls it, a morphine-like substance, thus making the child become autistic. Now, a lot of you may be being a bit confused. And why wouldn't you? I mean, a bowel disease that causes autism. I understand if it was something like an encephalitis or even at least an ear infection. But bowel disease, why would people really believe that? But there's actually a decent amount of evidence that would persuade people to think that there was a link. And I'm going to show you with this. This is the second table of the paper, this is the one that on the top of page 3. And as you can see, there's a lot of information there. I'm not going to overwhelm you with that. But I mostly want to talk about the behavioral diagnosis, the exposure identified by parents and doctors, and the interval from exposure to first behavioral symptoms. So as you can see, 10 of these 12 children were said that their behavioral diagnosis was autism, 2 of them saying it was some form of encephalitis. 8 blamed MMR for the behavioral changes. 2 of them did not give any claim, however, it did say when they had the MMR vaccine. 1 blamed recurrent otitis media, or a ear infection, often referred to as the third ear. And 1 blamed measles itself, though it does say that it was previously vaccinated with MMR. And I'm not going to highlight any of these because there's a lot of information. But as you can see, there isn't that big of a gap between these two happening. The longest gap really is 2 weeks. A couple of 1 week, there's some that are even 24 hours. Meaning that very close after taking MMR, they gained the autistic symptoms. Thus, it may be understandable why some people would believe that there is a link. These do happen so close to one another. Maybe there is something that connecting the two. I'm afraid to say, people, that all this is due to sheer coincidence. Let me explain why. And I want to ask you a question. You can answer if you want. When do children usually start showing autistic symptoms? Because again, autistic symptoms, we don't just pop out immediately autistic. Autism really is a developmental issue. It's something that comes as we develop, and we get more and more as our brain develops all the more. So they start showing up at some point. Does anyone want to have a guess at what time period the symptoms start? Does anyone want to guess?
12 to
correct? Though you are an expert on it, so that is kind of cheating. That's correct. The correct answer is usually random when it happens, but it's generally accepted that the usual time is around 12 to 18 months. And the parents of you will know the answer to this question. When do children usually get the MMR vaccine? Does anyone want to guess that? You're correct. The correct answer is first dose at 12 months, the second dose around 3 years and 4 months. And now you're starting to notice a pattern. The autistic symptoms and the first dose of MMR do happen very close to one another. It doesn't have to be exactly 12 months that the children have MMR. There are some children, actually, there was one child on the previous table that did have their MMR at 16 months. And therefore, it is understandable that these two would be very close together, and therefore also understandable why people would believe that there is a link. And there's one more thing I want to show you. As you can see here, it says right here, we did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described. Virological studies are underway that may help resolve this. This essentially means that they did not find a definitive link. There is no proof, even with this, that they had found a link between autism and MMR. In fact, the Lancet itself labeled this as an early report. This is actually something that was heavily criticized by people, including journalists at the time, saying that this was published too early in that case, because really it was. For studies to become public, usually you're meant to do multiple experiments, widening the scope more and more, but getting in potentially a couple hundred children, because there are millions of autistic children, and I would even back then, I would argue at the very least, the number of children who were autistic and had bowel disease were at least in the thousands. So you can't really say you found proof of all of this with only 12 children. However, at the very least, they did admit that they didn't find a link, that it was all theoretical. Then someone tell me why in 1998, that same year, they held a press conference for journalists only. This was done both by Wakefield and the Royal Free Hospital. And so there were a couple of things that happened, and there's a few interesting things that were discussed. For example, Wakefield started contradicting what was written in the paper. So you remember this section I mentioned before about how there was no association between measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. I'd be surprised if he did it. I mentioned it literally two minutes ago. Well, it's a good thing you do remember, because Wakefield didn't. He was saying throughout the entirety of that they had found a link, that there was a connection there, and they had proof, despite the fact that they didn't. There was no link. There was no link admitted in the article, and yet he said otherwise. The other interesting thing that he was talking about was his promotion of the abolishment of MMR and separating it into 3 vaccines. This was his main argument all throughout the scare, that the main issue wasn't entirely MM and R, but MMR. The combination of the 3 vaccines might be too much for the immune system for some children to handle. Therefore, his promotion was that they should separate it into 3 vaccines, 1 for measles, 1 for mumps, and 1 for rubella. And while some doctors did, or some journalists at least, did question whether or not, because it did come from the measles part of the vaccine, whether the measles vaccine in itself, by itself, would still cause it, he did say that parents should still have the choice. And this is something that I think when anti-vaxxers bring up Andrew Wakefield in their arguments, will completely blow them out the water. Because this man, during the scare, was not anti-vax. He was never anti-vax. In fact, he was so pro-vaccine, he was advocating for children to be taken more. And then, however, one last thing I want to mention about the press conference, there was still advocating for parents to give their children the MMR from other doctors. Because of course there was. Measles is a very contagious and potentially very dangerous disease. And therefore, it's understandable why some people, the doctors would still advocate for children to have it to help protect them. Unfortunately, this said otherwise. This is a videotape that was given to journalists to be with footage to be played on the nightly news. And while there was still advocating for the MMR vaccine on that by other doctors, it also included a child crying while being injected with a big needle, one child displaying very very apparent autistic behavior, with this mother right here proclaiming that she thought how she believed MMR caused her son's autism, and Wakefield advocating for his separation of the vaccines on multiple occasions. I believe the final count was 4. And again, there was still advocating for it, but I don't think these people got the memo. Let's talk about the news now. Now, even nowadays, even though the news obviously can be a bit iffy in some situations, it is still heavily believed that the news should be, a reliable source for information. You should expect them to be truthful, accurate, and, and present them in a, professional way. However, unfortunately, this news story was a perfect example of fear-mongering. To start off, they were reporting on it the night of the press conference. The very night after the press conference happened, there were every news station, newspaper, everything that had to do with news was reporting on this case. And of course, they were just mimicking what Wakefield had told them at the press conference. There were, as I said, people, as I keep saying, there were people advocating for vaccines, but the news just focused on Wakefield and showed videos of Wakefield, and they put him on a pedestal. They gave him a platform, and they essentially made him a celebrity, promoting his views over and over and over again, therefore making it seem all the more enticing, the story all the more enticing. They also did this by only really showing the most severe cases of autism. Now, I think we all know, obviously, it will be a bit of a misleading to say there are no cases in which people are very much affected by autism. But I would still argue that the majority are still fairly high functioning and can live a fulfilling life. They just need a bit more support. However, the news were just showing children screaming, having tantrums, essentially showing the hardest cases of autism out there, all for the purposes, of course, of keeping people in their seats, of getting them enticed in a story. Because if they just showed, I don't know, a bunch of people sitting around a table playing Warhammer, that's not exactly going to be too enticing to keep people in. Therefore, they show the most severe cases just to keep people in their seats and to get more views and whatnot. And then the last thing is, it was also heavily believed that none of the journalists ever actually read the Lancet article. Mostly because, again, they just mimicked what Wakefield was saying at the press conference, which heavily contradicted a lot of the things that were in the article, but also because if they had read the article, specifically on this section on page 4 and this section in page 5, they would know that he gave reference and credit to an article written by a man named H. Hugh Freudenberg, a wax shop ex-doctor who lost his medical license because he was caught stealing medical supplies from work for personal use, and who genuinely believes he can cure autism using a pill containing his own bone marrow. No, I am not making this up. And speaking of, what were the scientists' reaction? How did the scientists react to all of this? Well, put it simply, they were absolutely livid. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong type of mad scientist right there. Let me just fix that. There we go. What? I can't fix it, apparently. It just skips it. What the hell? Okay, anyway, just pretend that scientist is incredibly angry for, just pretend he's, I don't know. Perfect illustration of Wakefield right there. They were not happy at all. As I said, they kept advocating for the importance of MMR, and yet parents were ignoring those pleas because of what Wakefield was saying, because the media and everyone out there was talking about constantly how MMR was dangerous and how they should abolish it to keep it as the 3. And also, scientists were baffled by Wakefield's promotions because they don't know where it came from. They don't know where the scientific base came from. In fact, in the documentary I mentioned before, this woman, Mary Ramsey, okay, I don't know why, it's skipping the animations 2 at a time. But this woman, Dr. Mary Ramsey, was actually interviewed at in the 2004 documentary I mentioned before, and when Brian Deere asked, if there was, she could think of any basis as to where Wakefield found his MMR findings and the basis for the single vaccines, she's responded that she could not find any at all. There was absolutely nothing nothing she could think of to see how that was the case. And yet newspapers never reported on this. They did not once say that doctors were saying that they should not be, that this was a bad idea, that they couldn't find a basis. In fact, many of them defended Wakefield, actively defending what they wrote about, because back then the news was essentially the main way you got information about things. It's understandable why they would defend themselves, but still, yeah, I don't know what else to say. They just completely, anyway, I think it's about time we introduce you to this man, as I did just mention the documentary. This is, okay, I'll just do it on the laptop now. That seems to be doing better. This is Brian Deere. He is an award-winning investigational journalist. His accolades including 2 British Press Awards in 1999. He was awarded Specialist Reporter of the Year in 2011. And his book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, also received an Eric Hoffer Prize for nonfiction and a Golden Medal in the Independent Publisher Awards in 2021. He is also the man who debunked the MMR scare. This is the man who revealed everything. And as I said, there were other journalists who did question what Wakefield had said and who were essentially asking him questions, but there was none who really did any investigational work to see fully what Wakefield was saying was true, but he was the one. And when he did his findings, he published them in a documentary, MMR What They Didn't Tell You, in 2004, in the Sunday Times, and also in the British Medical Journal. And to start to show his first findings, this was actually revealed very early on. I want to take you to this timeline quickly. It's a very simple one. There's not a lot on there. But essentially, it's the study starting in 1993 and the Lancet article being published in 1998. And here's the interesting part that I actually learned during research. This study originally was for Crohn's disease. It was originally a study to see if there was a connection between Crohn's disease and MMR. Originally, it was only somewhere down the line that it shifted to autism. And this happened some point around 1996, where these people got involved. So let me introduce them. This is JABS, the Justice Awareness and Support Group for children who were damaged by vaccines. It was run by this woman, Jackie Fletcher, from Warrington, who was actually, you could essentially call her the original anti-vaxxer, because she was saying long before the MMR scare that her child became autistic after getting MMR, and she has tried to sue vaccine manufacturers. I need to say autism manufacturers. Who is the autism manufacturer? Stop it! He tried to sue vaccine manufacturers for numerous times, but nothing ever came through with it. And this man, it also got involved, this man right here, Richard Barr, a lawyer in association with JABS. I believe he became a solicitor for pharmaceutical purposes, just randomly stumbled into that. I can't remember what it was originally. It might have been finance or something. I honestly can't remember. But he saw the potential millions that could be made from a lawsuit if they did manage to link MMR with autism. So, guess who they brought in? You guessed it. Good old Andy Pandy right there. That's right. The entire reason why this study began was because Wakefield was hired by Richard Barr, paying him a total of £150 per hour, resulting in a total of £435,000, not adjusted for inflation, to do the study. To quote a letter from Richard Barr, to produce unassailable evidence in a court as to convince the court that these vaccines are dangerous. This is the entire reason the study began, because Wakefield was hired by a lawyer. There was never any scientific incentive into it or any incentive of protecting the children. It was all for this. And it seems that was not enough for Wakefield. As you see, even before the scare, he seemed to have other financial incentives. Let me give you an example. This is a patent for a new measles vaccine. I apologize, unlike the Lancet study, I could not find a digitized version of this document. The best I could find is this picture from Google Images and this one from MMR, What They Didn't Tell You. And it's a bit blurry, so you probably can't see, but right here, you can see one of the main inventor is Andrew Wakefield. And who's that right beneath him? Good old Mr. Moan Barrow himself. Good old Mr. Wait a minute, did I just say Moan Barrow? I just said Bone Marrow, Mr. Bone Marrow. Moan Barrow sounds like a wheelbarrow you mow the lawn with. Mr. Bone Marrow himself. Actually, interesting thing about Hugh Freudenberg, he, during MMR, What They Didn't Tell You, I'm going to be referencing that documentary a lot, Brian Deere did actually go and see Freudenberg, who did admit that he knew of Wakefield, even staying at his house one time, but said he never worked with him. He never worked on the study or on this measles patent. In fact, he has said his name was put on there without his knowledge or consent. Therefore, he shouldn't be on there. He was not an inventor. This patent was first revealed in MMR, What They Didn't Tell You. There's a picture of it right there. And I think right now a lot of you are probably thinking, of course, Wakefield tried to file a patent during the MMR scare. He was the one who was promoting the separation of the vaccine. Of course he would make one. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he if he was promoting so much? But that's the thing. This wasn't made or submitted during the MMR scare. In fact, it was filed 9 months before the Lancet article was even published. Meaning, right from the beginning, he had a financial incentive on this. And not only that, there was even a second patent proclaiming that he had found a treatment, possibly a complete cure to inflammatory bowel disease and autism. Obviously, he hadn't. Obviously, he hadn't. However, and the thing is, he would have made bank from this. This is a vaccine that would have been distributed worldwide. He would have made millions. One professor even said enough to buy a medical school with the measles patent alone. However, if it had worked, because you see, when presented to doctors, they were utterly baffled because the methods were incredibly unorthodox. Here's essentially what the methods were. So, inject mice with measles virus, extract the white blood cells, freeze it, thaw it, mix it with human blood cells, and then inject it into a pregnant goat. Yeah, there was no way it was working. Doctors said that if there was a chance of success, it would have been very, very slim. However, that's not the only way he tried to make bank off this scare. Let's look at his alleged financial incentives, alleged just to cover my grounds. So, in 1999, 1 year after the MMR scare began, he tried to get 3 companies off the ground. Immunospecifics Biotechnologies Limited, Carmel Healthcare Limited, named after his wife. Isn't that sweet? He had an affair and got a divorce, and they got a divorce. And Unigenics Limited. And these companies would have made the measles vaccine and also developed testing and diagnosis kits for autistic enterocolitis just in case. And you know what? They would not have made chump change of this. He would have made a lot. In fact, it was estimated that by year 3, they would have made 3.3 million, rising up to 28 million pounds. Again, not adjusted for inflation. On top of that, he also got £800,000 in government funding. I was even establishing connections with Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and SmithKline Buchan. In other words, he was on track to making loads of money. And you know what? And in case you're wondering what his colleagues thought of this, they had no idea. There were 13 people who worked on this study with him. None of them knew about his financial incentives. In fact, it was to the point where in 2004, when Brian Deere first released his association with Jabs and Richard Barr, 10 of the 13 people who wrote the Lancet article retracted their claims, saying that they had never found any connection between autism and MMR. And you know what? This was not the first way that things started going wrong for Wakefield. This started going wrong in a number of ways, long before this. And to start off with the obvious thing that went wrong, let's get the obvious out of the way. Autistic enterocolitis doesn't bloody exist. It is a made-up disease that was made up by Wakefield. None of this actually existed. So it's kind of difficult to get companies off the ground with a disease that you made up. So what do you have to do? Well, we started off by proving its existence, or at the very least, to try and convince the public that it did exist. So he brought in this man, Dr. John O'Leary from Trinity College in Dublin, and to try and meet some form of measles in the bowels of autistic children with bowel problems. And you know what? As you would probably expect, his testing found measles in the bowels of what? How? How is that the case? Come on, oh, thank God. Yeah, he didn't. Well, here's the thing. It did come up as positive. The testing did come up as positive, saying that he did find measles in the bowels of autistic children. But the thing is, all other scientists that replicated his study found nothing. And it's not because he lied. He didn't lie. It did actually come up as positive, but there's a simple reason for it. That's because this study used a PCR test, which, according to the Cleveland Clinic here, is a way to find some form a virus from DNA or RNA, mostly either from a bodily fluid or using the swab to part of the body. So this is something you'll actually probably be familiar with because this is the same test that we use for the COVID tests. And the thing is, and obviously we're looking for measles in the bowel, so a swab wouldn't have done it. It actually had to be bodily fluid. And this kind of PCR test is very delicate. It actually requires a substance called UNG to clean as you go. Otherwise, it could very easily lead to contamination, and you've probably already figured out what went wrong. It turns out all the other tests after O'Leary used 50 times the amount of UNG that he did. And part of the reason why I believe it was contamination was because his findings contained DNA, which is funny because measles doesn't contain DNA. It's an RNA, therefore it was eventually concluded that O'Leary's results were due to contamination. And that's not the only way things went wrong. There's actually one really big thing that happened with Wakefield, and it's a good old feud. We do love feuds, don't we? So this is Mark Pepys. He became the head of medicine in the Royal Free Campus from 1999 to 2011. And the thing is, the Royal Free Hospital, well, it seemed a bit mixed on Wakefield. On one hand, they still advocated that children should be getting MMR, and they weren't fully agreeing with everything that Wakefield said, but they did still promote him, given a platform and what have you. And Pepys, however, was not a fan. He was an expert in areas that Wakefield was making claims about. Therefore, he did not agree with anything that Wakefield said. But, you know what? He was still willing to placate him, to humor him, if you will. So, in 1999, about a couple months after he became head of medicine, he sent a 2-page letter to Wakefield, essentially giving him an ultimatum, asking him to do something very important, that thing being to do another MMR study. But this time, make it bigger, widen the scope. Because again, you can't judge an entire population of millions just from 12 children. You need to do it bigger. So, and he was really willing to help Wakefield. He was going to give him a 1-year absence with pay to do the study, and also 150 children, more than 12 times the amount that Wakefield had used in his previous study. And in his return, Wakefield would keep his job. This was something that any scientist would love. To be able to study something that you are passionate about, and also being provided with funds to do it. That would be amazing for any scientist. So Wakefield initially agreed to do it. Did he actually do it? What do you think? He never actually did it. There was a ton of inquiries and requests. There were phone calls, there was letters, and months went by, all of which were ignored. And eventually in October of 2001, one after a bunch of ignorances, and Wakefield essentially being incredibly up himself and going, me and my colleagues will do the study when we feel like it. Big surprise, Wakefield got the boot. He was no longer working for the Royal Free Hospital. However, he still said afterwards, oh, I was fired because my theories weren't popular. They were controversial. They weren't popular. My brother in Christ, they gave you a press conference. They put you on a platform. They promoted you. Of course, we all know the main reason why he didn't do the test. And the reason is, as I said before, because they would have proved once and for all that autistic enterocolitis doesn't bloody exist. You don't have to apologize. It's okay. And now we get to the experiment itself. Let's talk about the experiment and what happened within the actual study of the MMR. Since I did just mention it, it's only appropriate. So, the experiment involved 12 children staying at the hospital for a week, and okay, I'm afraid to say this is where the fun stops. Because what happened, actually this picture feels a bit inappropriate while talking about this, so I'll take that away. What happened to these children during the study is harrowing, to say the least. To put it simply, they suffered in this experiment. They went through a number of invasive procedures that would have been incredibly painful, from blood sampling to general anesthetics, all the way up to colonoscopies and lumbar punctures. And to say that they struggled is downplaying it massively. So I'm not going to go into detail on how exactly these kids bared these experiments, because I don't feel comfortable talking about it, and I don't want to subject you to any of it. I will still talk about some things in the experiment, but I'm not going to go into detail on what exactly happened to these children. But one thing I will say is this right here, that a consultant told Brian Deere on the telephone in MMR, what they didn't tell you. I feel the whole show is in terrible turmoil. Nurses were leaving and saying they didn't like what was being done to these children. Junior doctors weren't happy. It needed 3 people to hold these kids down in some cases just to have blood taken. These are difficult children to explain to what is going on. I feel very sorry for the children who I feel were abused. And that is the general gist of it. Those kids were abused. And a perfect example of this, I'm going to show you this. This is the consent form that was sent to the parents of the children who were to be in the study. Now, the consent form did feature a lot of the things that you would expect from consent forms. What procedures would be done, how long the children would be there for, what exactly would entail with their time there. But there was one important thing that was not mentioned anywhere within this consent form, and that is the risks. There were never any mention of the risks within these procedures. In fact, in H. Bomber Guy's video, he said the word risk was never written in this consent form. I wanted to be thorough with my research, so I did read it. He's right. The word risk is not written once in this. When describing the procedures, all that will happen, all that is said is that these are usually tolerated well by children, and that is entirely painless. Now, I've never had lumbar punctures or colonoscopies, but I would imagine there's some pain or really some discomfort to come from it. And there's a reason why risks are important to be mentioned within the study, because that way you can avoid, so the children will know what they're going into and what the worst case scenario can be. And the reason why it was incredibly important in this is because one of those children did meet the worst case scenario. One of the children, the colonoscopy for one of the children, one named Jack Piper, went so horribly wrong, he was rushed to another hospital and spent 2 weeks in intensive care. It's literally, as you can see there, fighting for his life with numerous organ failures. And again, his parents were never informed of it. They were never told of the risk. And therefore, by definition of the Royal Mail, it meant that the surgery was performed without lawful consent and was an assault. That is how bad it can be if you don't show the risks. And what's the fate of Jack Piper now? Well, currently, he's having to go through around-the-clock care with lifelong disabilities, all because of this experiment. And for those of you who are wondering, well, surely it was worth it. It must be kind of worth it. There must have been something that they found in there. This man says otherwise. This is Nicholas Chadwick, Wakefield's former research assistant. It was his job to try and find measles within the children. He did this by testing tissue samples and by extracting brain fluid through lumbar punctures. And when asked if he found measles in the children, his response was, no. No single case did I find measles in those children. They found nothing, absolutely nothing. Those children went through all those procedures for nothing. And Wakefield wasn't satisfied with this. He claimed that it must have been sensitivity issues in Chadwick's methods that said otherwise, that said they didn't find measles, despite the fact that these were methods that Wakefield had previously approved of. And in fact, there was a professor who was asked if he would have found it, and he said that Chadwick is rigorous with his work, and he was doing really good, and his methods were so accurate, if there were measles in his children, he would have found them. As we expected, Chadwick requested that his name be removed from the Lancet article because his results were essentially lied about. And that's not the only lie within that article. There are plenty more. But before we do that, let's talk about something a little bit more fun. Let's talk about the aftermath of MMR, what they didn't tell you. First of all, let me show you one of the last things that was in the documentary. Hey, would you look at that? Star-crossed lovers found at last. Yeah, at the very end of it, Andrew Wakefield and Brian Deere finally met. Andrew Wakefield had been aware of Brian Deere and had been aware that he had been pursuing him all throughout the early 2000s. And so when they finally met, what did he do? He did a Sir Robin. To quote one of the greatest comedies of all time, when danger reared his ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled. Essentially, as soon as he saw Brian Deere, he ran away. Well, not quite ran away. He fled, completely ignoring all requests to answer any of his questions. And therefore, and after this documentary went up, Andrew Wakefield filed a defamation lawsuit on Channel 4, Sunday Times, and Brian Deere's own personal website. And he's worth for public relations purposes. Even the judge was saying it was all for public relations purposes. But do you want to know the funny thing about that? As scary as you may think it may sound for Brian Deere, this turned out to be one of Wakefield's biggest mistakes. Because you see, seeing as the lawsuit was related to accusations on Wakefield's study, records from that study were labeled as evidence, including the medical records of the 12 children. And with supervision from the lawyer, Brian Deere had access to those records. You can imagine Andrew Wakefield was not happy when he heard that. You can imagine his reaction. In fact, you don't have to, because the night after Brian Deere got back, after reading those records, his lawyer called saying that Wakefield had dropped the lawsuit because he did not want them reading them. And this only got Brian Deere more invigorated. Okay, I'm going to have to go through this next bit a bit quick because we have 5 minutes before our break. So let me go through this quickly. Who knew talking for a long time would make your throat dry? So to start off, Brian Deere, all this was published in his British Medical Journal articles. Brian Deere actually got in contact with the father of child 11. So he gave the father a copy of the Lancet article, and when reading the details of his son, the father simply replied with, "That's not true." There were plenty of lies about his son in this article, and these are the lies that followed. First of all, he was told that his child was the 13th child they looked at, not the 11th. Either to make the study seem more valid, or possibly, and this is my personal opinion, to hide the fact that he wrote lies about his child. The second thing that he said was his child's autistic symptoms occurred at 13 months, not 15 like was written in the article. However, when the child got his MMR vaccine, that date was still the same, meaning that the child's autistic symptoms actually, meaning that the child got his MMR vaccine 1 month after his first autistic symptoms occurred, meaning there was absolutely no link. And you know what? Brian Deere, that's not as far as Brian Deere went. He also went to the mother of child 2, who said that her child's autistic symptoms occurred 6 months after her child had MMR. And these two weren't the only one. There were plenty of other things that were lied about within this document. To go back to this table quickly, as it turns out, numerous children had the interval from exposure to first behavioral symptom changed to make it seem more convenient. As a matter of fact, childs 1 to 4, 6 to 8, and 11 all had this part changed in the table, either because there was too wide of a gap for the two to seem connected, or their autistic symptoms occurred before they ever got the MMR vaccine. Part of the reason why the parents were probably okay with it was because a number of the parents, not all of them, I'm not sure exactly which ones, but a number of the parents were associated with jabs, the support group I mentioned before, meaning they also would have benefited from the lawsuit. I'm not sure if this was changed by Wakefield or the parents actively told lies, but they would have benefited from this. And I also want to point out, oh shit, one, sorry. This table, this is another table from the top of page 2. Now there's a lot of science gobbledygook I'm not going to pretend to be smart enough to understand. But the one thing I want to point out particularly is this part, chronic non-specific colitis. This was something that a lot of children were labeled to have. In fact, a total of 11 of these children were labeled to have non-specific colitis. This is essentially to be seen as the autistic enterocolitis that Wakefield was pointing out. Not all these children, not all of them had non-specific colitis. Not even half of them. If you want total numbers, 3 had any kind of inflammation within their intestines. Only 3 of them. The rest of these, their guts were perfectly fine, nothing for them. In fact, that's not all. For going back to this table, there was one thing that these 10 children had that these 2 didn't. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Anyone want to hazard a guess? No? Okay, then the correct answer is autism. These 2 children, child 7 and 12, were never once diagnosed with autism before or after the study. Child 12 was never diagnosed. In fact, child 7, what turns out, was the brother of child 6, who was autistic and did have inflammation. So they just assumed that child 7 would just have it as well. In fact, child 7 was also the only one on the previous table whose historical findings were labeled as normal. Why is he even here? Yeah. These were all just lies to make his case seem all the more valid. There were so many lies within this paper. It's no wonder the Lancet retracted it. It's no wonder it turned out there was absolutely no findings. This is a paper of lies and fraud. And so now we get to probably one of my favorite parts, the end of Wakefield. How did things end for him? I'm going to be honest, I'm going a lot faster than I ever did in practice. So how did things end for Wakefield? Well, the main thing that ended him was in 2007, the General Medical Council began a hearing against Wakefield and his colleagues. As you can see here, it was because it was believed that his study was done without ethical approval, and he was accused of potentially harmful tests on the children that were not clinically indicated. And you know what? This was a long study. This hearing actually lasted for 217 days, longest in medical history, or as many people said, longer than the O.J. Simpson trials. And you know what? When the hearing was done, he was charged with multiple counts of dishonesty and fraud and harm towards children, Wakefield, the chairman said that Wakefield did not regard the clinical interest for the children and that he absolutely did not have the ethical approval or the qualifications for the study and acted with, to quote, a callous disregard for the distress and pain the children might suffer. So, and thus finally ended with Wakefield and his colleagues being struck off the medical boards and no longer being able to practice medicine, meaning that he was no longer a doctor. Which is the best outcome, which is the absolute best news, isn't it? Everything's great now. Wakefield's gone, except not entirely, because outside the courthouse was this, a mob of people cheering, "We're with Wakefield, we're with Wakefield," and constantly proclaiming that there is, in fact, still saying that he's just looking out for children. He just wants to protect the children. Wakefield, when he came out, only added fuel to the fire by saying, "I am extremely disappointed with the outcome. The allegations against me and my colleagues are unfounded and unjust, and I invite anyone to examine these contents of these proceedings and come to their own conclusions." Oh, Andrew, I think we already have. You're a filthy liar. And thus, next slide is going to be the last one I do before we go to a break, because it has been over an hour, I've been talking for an hour, and thus leads to what many consider the victims of the scare. Now, obviously, many would think the children who ended up being unvaccinated because of it, or the parents who potentially lost their children because of the scare, but many agree that the real victims were these people, the people who were still advocating for Wakefield's theories, for still cheering and saying that Wakefield was just looking out for the best interests of children. And this is where we get into why I think some people will become anti-vax in the end. And that's because, well, they will probably feel guilt. Many of them will feel guilt for that there was something wrong with them that caused a child to become autistic and therefore might latch onto this to try and take some of that guilt away from them, or they might get them to feel even worse, making them think that because their child never asked to be vaccinated with MMR, they never gave a choice. It had a choice. It was always their choice, and therefore, because of that, they want to try and stop and promote that people shouldn't do it so they don't make the same mistake that they did. It's really unfortunate that there are so many people who still chose to believe Wakefield's lies, and still do, because, well, they are lies, and they have been tricked. So Wakefield could could make more money, and he still is with these people. He has released books and documentaries that I would imagine these people would have bought. It's unfortunate, and now we're going to go to a quick break because my mouth is very dry and it's been over an hour.
Okay, shall we have a very quick break so we can get to the end of the presentation with questions? Is there anything there?
No, it caused no side effects whatsoever.
Because what we've got here is an autistic individual who's actually, this is the best, most in-depth exploration of this that I've ever heard. And this is what is going to, yes, here. And this is what is going to take us through all the attacks that are going on. The autistic people, we need to stand together. Please sign the National Autistic Society, whatever it's called. The thing that's on the website, Petition, please sign that. If we stand together with this sort of level of intellect, research, attention to detail, we will be able to stand solid against the attacks that are going on at the moment against autistic people, trans people, both, anything that's a bit different.
I mean, his entire presentation took up a month of my life. I really hope it's been very good so far.
And Calvin and I spent time yesterday also talking about, we know there will undoubtedly be a backlash. So what we're going to do, Calvin and I, is going to make sure that this presentation is promoted left, right and centre. And I would urge all of you to do this when it's up on the website, because I know Wakefield is still adored by particularly a number of mothers I know he has meetings where the doors close behind and all these women think he's I don't understand it. I don't know how they fall for it. I spoke to Luke, who did appear at one time with Andrew Wakefield, and I said, was he very charismatic? And Luke said, not particularly. But there must be something.
A lot of people were saying he was quite charismatic.
Yeah, Luke said he wasn't, but maybe.
Though at the same time, they were saying he was also handsome, which I don't really agree with that. Yeah, like there's what's his name from Autumn Watch, I think it is.
Yeah.
Chris Packham.
Yeah, Chris Packham. Yeah, who he actually said said to one of the newspapers going on about how he's not I'm autistic, not broken, that kind of thing during modern day thing. Yeah, like there are a lot of people out there who are showing the good sides of autism. Like, I think he's one of the perfect examples because he's taken his passion or special interest and has essentially made it his job, and he seems to be bloody loving it.
Well, I think we've got an example here of an autistic person who's, bearing in mind this is the first presentation Elliot has ever done, and having done millions of presentations myself, you know, for your first presentation.
It's a big one. It's a big topic for you first.
We're going to get into the next part, which is going to be on the modern day stuff with anti-vax. This is going to be a fair bit shorter, maybe like 15, 20 minutes. The next session. But I want to start off by talking about someone I'm certain we are all aware of. Ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to boo. I love this crowd. Okay, so as you know, this is Robert F. Kennedy. He is the son of Robert F. Kennedy and a nephew of John F. Kennedy. Yes, that John F. Kennedy. He was an environmental lawyer before eventually becoming the U.S. Secretary of HHS, or Health and Human Services. He is also a conspiracy theorist, an avid anti-vaxxer, and in my personal opinion, a complete wacko. This is a man who has opinions that he's not afraid to talk about. His main one being, of course, one of the main opinions shared here by Mr. Donald Trump, that there is currently an autistic epidemic going on over in America, and it's certain that there is some external cause, a lot like a lot of the other people I mentioned at the very beginning. And the reason they believe in this is because, as you can see there, the numbers of autism is going up. There are currently, in 2018, there were 8 times more autistic people than there were in 1998. And they are thinking that there must be something that is causing this to happen. There must be something in the air, or in the vaccines or whatever. The thing is, anyone who knows anything about autism will know that increase in number is bloody brilliant. Anyone who knows anything about autism will know that these numbers is an amazing news, because this isn't a number of more, this isn't just more people becoming autistic, this is more people getting diagnosed. This is more people getting diagnosed and discovering who they are, as they're learning about a very big, important part of their life. And because there are more people getting diagnosed, it also means that the world is slowly getting more awareness and understanding, not just for autism, but the people who are afflicted with it, which is not a great word, but I couldn't think of any other word to use. And also, with more awareness and support and understanding, means there's more support for autistic people. Because I'm not the first to say this, I won't be the last. Autistic people struggle within the world. This world is really not suited for it, for us. But with more awareness and understanding, more support, we are slowly getting closer to that world where we can fit in. A world where we do get the support and care that we want. But they don't see this. They don't see that part. They see autism as a bad thing, and there must be something to fix it. And part of the thing they're doing with that, as I said, is going against vaccine and are vastly underestimating the potential issues that can come with the diseases that vaccines prevent. Like, for example, currently, there is a measles outbreak going on in America and the UK, and they are severely downplaying the threat of measles because here's the thing, if you are unvaccinated, there is a 90% chance of you catching it if you come into contact with it. Compare that to if you are vaccinated, where there is a 3% chance of you catching it. And even if you do, the effects of measles will be heavily downplayed. It won't be affected by it as much. Whereas if you are unvaccinated, 3 out of every 1,000 people who do catch it will end up dying, which may not sound like very high statistics, but even if there was a chance of death, surely you would not do it. If I gave you a drink, as I said, it was one of the nicest drinks in the world, but there was a 0.3% chance of you dying when you drink it, I promise you, a lot of people aren't going to drink it. I wouldn't take that risk. And even if you don't die, there are a number of complications that could come about from measles. Yes, a lot of people know it as just a bad rash, but with complications, that also includes dehydration, ear infections, pneumonia, encephalitis, which can cause brain damage. In fact, there was a child who ended up getting brain damage earlier this year after being infected with the flu, and also complications with pregnancy, including the potential loss of the fetus. And currently in America, as I said, there is an outbreak going on. So far, last I checked, which was 2 days ago, it might be changed now, there were 1,514 cases, 92% of those being unvaccinated. It led to 185 or 12% hospitalized, nearly half of which being children under the age of 5, and also 3 deaths, which I like to note. The first death was a child in Texas, and that was the first measles-related death in America in over a decade. And RFK is downplaying it. He is heavily downplaying the threat of measles, despite the fact that, as I said, it is a very dangerous disease that could be potentially deadly. And he also follows a big mindset, which I think a lot of other anti-vaxxers have, which is not trying to prove that there is a cause, but trying to convince you that there is. Because there are dozens of studies that prove that there is nothing that links to 2 people catching autism. You can't catch it like the common cold, it's just not possible. But RFK is trying to convince you that there is. So, as I say, they did another MMR test study earlier in March, for some reason. And to head that, he brought in this man, David Geyer, who is not only also a rabid anti-vaxxer, his father, fun fact, was actually a doctor. I say was because he got his medical license revoked in 10 states and was said by a court that he is at best negligent, if not a fraud on the court. And also, David Geyer got in trouble in 2012 for practicing medicine on children without a license. This is the man RFK has brought in, a rabid anti-vaxxer who just does not have a license. Another thing that anti-vaxxers do, which RFK also does, and something that unfortunately has not changed from the scare, is that they heavily misrepresent autism. Now, what I'm going to put on the screen is something he said at a press conference. I'm not going to read it out loud because it is quite upsetting. Feel free to read it out loud if you choose to. I'm going to be frank, these words are offensive to people with autism. I find them deeply offensive because they are, not only are they misrepresenting, they are also incredibly demeaning, almost referring to them as subhuman, all in the guise of sympathy towards them. It is genuinely awful, the things he said. So I'm not going to read these out. I'm going to take what he says and I'm going to use it to pander to all of you, to bump you all out, to bump you all up. Because just by being here and just by living your lives, you are proving these words wrong. And I've seen this constantly throughout the PDSGs. For example, he says many autistic people won't hold down a job. Hands up, who here has had a job for more than 5 years? Exactly. Many of you have. Many of you are able to hold down jobs. He says they'll never be able to go on a date. I've seen people come to PDSGs with their partners, with their significant others, boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, many people who they have been with for years, lifelong partners, completely proven them wrong. He says many will never go to the toilet unassisted. Not once have I seen you go for a shit with your carer. Don't ask me why I'm watching. And I'm also going to bump myself up a little bit because there are a number of things that I do that, in his word, I would not be able to. Now, autism, I will admit, has held me back in a lot of ways. There are a number of things I struggle to do because of it. Despite being 28, I still live with my parents. I cannot make a phone call, answer an important email, or fill out a form without getting so anxious it could cause me to hyperventilate. In fact, last year, and Mum will know this, I rung up the Royal Mail because they sent a package to the wrong house. I had to call her afterwards to stop myself from having a panic attack. Literally, there are a number of things that autism has held me back. Yeah, exactly, I still did it. But you know what? Despite that, I'm still doing a ton of stuff that autistic people struggle with. I've had this job with Axia for 5 years, for example, and to be quite frank, I get too much praise. I get a lot of praise from the people I work with that I don't think I deserve, but they still give it to me anyway. Before the pandemic happened, I was going to nerd conventions with friends every year, and in fact, since 2023, I've been regularly going to gigs and festivals. I've traveled to Manchester, London, some were even abroad in Germany and Miami. And these are environments that a lot of people will say is very unsuited to autistic people, how they are incredibly loud, there's a lot of flashing lights, how it can get very chaotic. And you know what? I am bloody addicted to them. I go to so many and I love them so much. In the next 6 months, me and my mates have 10 booked. And one of them I'm going to on my own simply because I love them that much. In his world, I would not be able to do that. In his world, all that will be an impossibility. So just by living our lives, just by living our every day, we are proving this man and every single anti-vaxxer who speaks ill of autistic people wrong. And before I end this, I want to talk about something positive, because I've been talking about a lot of negativity in this and a lot of things are doom and gloom, but I do think that things have changed from the MMR Scare for the better. Obvious example, more research has gone into vaccines and autism. Not just recently, there were even some that went into the MMR Scare, such as this one from Japan in 2005, and this one from London in 2008. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that a lot of research in autism has possibly been due to the misinformation spread in the MMR Scare. I could be wrong by that, but that's my personal belief. Secondly, the news has taken what's said a lot more scrutiny. I said before that the news just took what End of Wakefield said at face value and actively defended what they're reporting. But now we get a lot of reporters talking about other people, not only other people criticizing people like RFK and Donald Trump, but also actively calling them out themselves, actively stating how their words are utter bullshit and how they are potentially dangerous to the public because of them. And finally, also, we are getting more accurate information faster than ever. And I mostly associate this with social media. Social media, in my opinion, is definitely a boon and a curse. It's in many ways, has made human beings more connected than ever, but in other ways, it's also divided us more than ever. But I think it's also a very good place for you to find accurate information if you are looking at it. Yes, you will find a lot of misinformation, but there are people who will call out that misinformation and say what the truth actually is, or they'll just call it absolute bollocks and call them an offensive slur, but whatever. And also back then, as I said before the break, you had to go to certain places to find pieces of information, like books, magazines, radios, TV shows, all over the place. Meanwhile, now in the same place, you can find dog pictures and deep faces of Ryan Gosling. You can find information from the Royal Health Organization, actual doctors, and the National Autistic Society calling out Donald Trump and RFK for the Tylenol causes autism bullshit. And I think that is an incredibly important thing to take away, that things have gotten better from that. and that the world is slowly becoming a better place, which is why this is going to be the very end of it, don't worry. I want to end with something, a bit of hope, because I will be the first to admit, I am an eternal optimist. In many ways, it's good because it means I see the best in people, but in other ways, when I get betrayed by someone, I especially feel it. And I do think we can get to a better place. We managed to get past the MMR scare, and I think what's currently going on, especially with so many big organizations and so many people calling out the lies when they see it, we can get past this and the world will become a better place. So I want to end this with a quote that I often think of when I'm in a depressive episode and makes me think that things will be okay. And I also think it works with this because people think humanity is always going down, but it's always a swivel. It goes up and down. Night always comes. The night is dark and lonely, but the sun will eventually rise. I want to end with this quote from Rhythm of War by Brendan Sanderson. It's one of my favorite. It's on my archive. It's one of my favorite series, and it is as follows. "It won't be foot like foot for me," Kaladin said. "You told me it will get worse." "It will," Wit said. "But then it will get better. Then it will get worse again, then better. This is life, and I will not lie by saying that every day will be sunshine, but there will be sunshine again, and that is a very different thing to say. That is truth. I promise you, Kaladin, you will be warm again." I've been Elliot Chapman. I'll shut up now.